Welcome to Access Back Channel, expert conversations about sexual abuse, treatment, and prevention. I am your host, Alejandro Leguizamo. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Jason Rydberg and Beth Huebner. Jason Rydberg is an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Justice Studies at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, where he is also co-director for the Center for Program Evaluation. He received his PhD in criminal justice from Michigan State University. His research utilizes advanced quantitative methods and program evaluation methodologies focused on areas including sex offense policy, prisoner reentry, and recidivism. Beth Huebner is the director and Watts Endowed Professor for Public Safety for the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. Her work focuses on the consequences of a criminal conviction, inequalities, community and institutional corrections, and public policy. Well, thank you very much, Jason and Beth, for joining me in this rendition of the Back Channel. Nice to meet you. We're here
as well.
Thank you. We're here in the Northeast and in the West, from Arizona, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. So today we wanted to talk about issues of housing and potential recidivism among those convicted of sex offenses. And first, I wanted to ask, for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, how you came to study this particular area.
Well, I can start first. This is Beth. I went to Michigan State University, go green, just like Jason, and worked with Tim Bynum. And so my research area has always been mass incarceration and the collateral consequences of a felony conviction. And so one of the first projects he had me do was look through case files of people with a sex offense and look at recidivism and code those. And so I hadn't been exposed to this population in any great detail before that. And so that project just piqued my interest, looking at some of the consequences, some of the requirements that this group had. This is when registries began to develop. I've been doing this for a long time, and this is when the Center for Sex Offense Management was very prominent as well, and he had been working with them. So I started that project. It was successful. We got some papers out about that, and I think it was in 2007 or 2008, I can't remember, National Institute of Justice had a call for a study on residence restrictions. And at that time I was living in Missouri, and they had some of the first residence restrictions, as well as Tim living in Michigan. So we started out with a project there to evaluate those. And so I've been writing on those data and doing projects off that for many years to come. So it's really, like many of us, kind of happenstance who we worked with. And that will bring me to Jason, who is linked to this as well.
Yeah, hello, I'm Jason. And yeah, I was a graduate student at Michigan State University, after Beth had graduated and gone on, and the project that I was kind of assigned to work to, as a graduate assistant under Tim Bynum, was this multi-site evaluation of sex offender residence restrictions. And so up until that point, I'd never really considered individuals convicted of sexual offenses as being a research area of mine, but I took it and ran with it. I was really interested in the criminal justice system response, to these individuals, the public response to these individuals. And for my dissertation research off that project, I looked at the challenges that those individuals face as they are, exiting prison and returning to the community. And that was doing a lot of interviews, qualitative research, and it was good for the research question. But what I really enjoy doing is statistics and quantitative methods. And so since then, I've really kind of worked on some questions involving individuals convicted of sexual offenses and sex offender residence restrictions since then.
Could you talk about, for those who may not be familiar, about what are some of the residence restrictions that people convicted of sex offenses have? In general, not like, you don't have to go like very formal.
Yeah, well, so in these policies have kind of changed over time. But at the time that Beth and I were doing this research in Michigan, Missouri, essentially what we have is a policy where once an individual with a sex offense conviction is released from prison, there are restrictions that are placed on where they are eligible to reside. And so this would do something like establishing what's called a safety zone around places like schools, daycares, and then in different states, there could be bus stops, wide variety of different locations. What they're designed to do is to attempt to reduce the opportunity that individuals convicted of sexual offenses would have to be around areas where children congregate. And so it works under this assumption that those, people with those offense histories will gravitate towards those locations or strategically put themselves close to those locations so that they have access to victims. Those are some relatively dubious assumptions regarding how sex offending works. And so most of the research that you would see on these topics has really questioned the public safety efficacy of these different policies. But my research on public opinion has also shown that they are widely supported, by the general public, and the public would continue to support them even if there was no evidence that they were effective anyways.
Yeah, and I think one challenge that I have with them, and as part of this research, although I think Jason's public policy work is so important here as well, is that we make these blanket policies for all people with a sex offense, and just the assumption that they all have child victims and young child victims often. And so, again, that's another assumption that is not correct, but not often known by the public here. So. It's been an interesting study to see all of these factors come together over time.
Yeah, here in Massachusetts, they had I have heard in the radio examples of some towns where no place in town is a place where the person can live because everything is a red zone and they can't. So, what are some of the challenges that you have found these individuals have when they are released from prison?
Well, I think I'll just start with a few of them and I'll have Jason add in. I mean, I think what you just said is the perfect example, is that, we have these safety zones, and Kelly Sosha and Jason and other people have done this work that shows there's many cities where you can't live anywhere. So it can be schools, parks, daycares, the list can go on and on depending on the state or even the municipality. Some municipalities have more than 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet or something like that. And so that could really take things over. And so it's an extreme challenge for people to find a place to live when they come out of prison in general. So, want to establish that for anyone with a felony record, it's very difficult. But on the other side, we also know that this is one of the biggest factors in terms of success. A house provides this kind of basis, a touch point for you to kind of spring off in terms of success. And so one other factor I want your listeners to think about is that right now we're finding even more challenges. So if you can find a place that's not in the residence restrictions area, you also have to make sure the landlord doesn't discriminate or not consider you because of your criminal record. And then I know where you guys are, particularly, and me as well, I'm in a very hot housing market, trying to find a place that's affordable. So with this housing boom, I think that's one thing that has brought this topic again to the top of the list. But I'll have Jason add some of this stuff that he's seen in his research as well.
Yeah, of course. Just building on that, like you'd mentioned, Kelly Sosha, he's done fantastic research on kind of the implications of these different restriction policies and what potentially happens to the housing market when you increase the scope, of the residence restrictions. And he finds that establishing, like just this, residence restriction policy tends to push, people returning from prison towards areas with less affordable housing. So like outside of cities, for instance, areas that have fewer resources, areas that are more disadvantaged. So like these are all challenges that, especially individuals convicted of sexual offenses, will face. But as Beth mentioned, for just, people returning from prison in general, there's few resources to navigate that private market. They may be alienated from personal networks when it comes to like going back to live with a spouse or going to live with your parents. Now, this could be, for a variety of reasons. It could be personal disowning. It could just be attempting to knife off, bad social ties, in the past. But especially for those with sexual convictions, we know that so many of these offenses occur, intrafamiliar, whatnot, and that's another major reason why those options may not be available anymore. So it definitely compounds some of those risks.
So then we're dealing with individuals that are returning to the community to unstable circumstances, isolated, and discriminated. All factors that then can contribute to negative emotions and potentially recidivism. Right? What have you found with that respect of housing instability and recidivism?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, on that, like, there's been some research in the past, which has, I mean, a lot of research has suggested just how important a stable housing situation is to the reentry process, because it is a foundation. Having stable housing allows you to have an effective employment search. It allows you to get established in substance use and social ties and all those sorts of things. When you don't have it, that foundation's not there. And with general offender populations, there has been some research that has suggested that having an unstable housing situation, so moving frequently, for instance, is associated with increased odds of recidivism events, rearrest or return to prison. In some cases, it's not saying that all movement is bad. Like in some cases, a small number of housing changes after someone's release can be a sign of moving to independence, for instance, of initially staying with friends or family or a treatment environment to then going out on their own. But what we were kind of interested in here was this really high frequency of housing instability. And so we had observed, just kind of connecting back to the previous topic here, we had observed that in Michigan, for those with sexual convictions who were released following the implementation of residence restrictions, they were significantly more likely to have a high number of moves, like 5 or more housing changes within just a few years, compared to similar individuals who were released prior to residence restrictions. So we were interested in whether, is that, what's the association here between that level of housing instability and the risk of rearrest? And up until this point, there really hadn't been a study that focused specifically on individuals convicted of sexual offenses and that association, which was surprising because we had just, based on what we know, we had suspected that those instabilities, would be exacerbated, among this group. So that's really where we kind of set out, with this particular study. And kind of the long and short of it is that, we observed that there is an association, between housing instability and recidivism. We looked at those who were convicted of sex offenses against adults, those who were convicted of sex offenses against children, and we used a match sample of individuals without a history of sexual convictions as kind of a counterpoint. And we find that those who were convicted of offenses against adults, each additional time they moved basically increased the odds of rearrest by about 40%. And we saw a similar effect among those with, again, that's the baseline odds. So it's not like 40, 80, et cetera, but it multiplied the odds by 40%. And then a similar effect among those, convicted of offenses against children, but no corresponding effect for those with a non-sexual conviction. So housing instability was not associated with recidivism among that group. And then we also considered, does housing instability have an effect on the likelihood that they return to prison on a technical violation, which can be connected to a criminal offense, but it might not be, as well. And so there we saw relatively larger effects. So like a 150+% increase in baseline odds for sexual convictions against adults, sexual convictions against children, and a statistically significant but smaller effect for those convicted of non-sexual offenses. And so this does suggest that housing instability does have a somewhat unique or at least exacerbated effect on recidivism for those with sexual offense convictions.
Yeah, I mean, Jason did an amazing job summarizing that. And I think, all of our findings, I think, are very important. I think the technical violations are something that we want to look at carefully as well, or particularly with a different lens, in that, people with sex offense convictions are watched more closely, right? They're supervised more closely, understandably. But and one of the requirements is that you have a stable home. And so again, we need people to have a stable home to do well. It's also a part of their requirements on parole. So this is an important way that we can help people be successful. But because this is a requirement and it's difficult, this is where we see people kind of trip up. And so that's just reinforces the need for housing for this group and stable housing.
Part of the issue I can see people in the general public, as Jason was saying before about the support for these policies, is this idea that those convicted of sex offenses are these monsters or highly unusual people that that gets. Well, actually, I was going to say that gets reinforced in the media, but there's plenty of sexual aggression in the media where these are not monsters, but regular people. But we do know that sexual aggression is really endemic in society, and it is very close to us. Likely, we all know people that have been victimized and that have committed some form of sexual aggression. So the idea, I think that the residency restrictions are very palatable with this view of these individuals as being other, as opposed to being somebody, an entire person that did something really horrendous, but the goal being that they are not anymore victims. I think that the thinking could be or should be that what can we do in order to prevent that from happening again? So there goes to the education or public policy, but what are some of your thoughts about what can we do in order to change people's minds, if at all possible?
That's a great question. I mean, on the change people's minds, that's kind of where some of my current research is. So, I mean, past few years, so I published a paper that did a simple kind of survey vignette experiment where it was presenting people with findings on sex offense residence restrictions. So it's two particular findings: that they have no public safety benefit, and which is true when you look at the body of evidence, and that they produce negative collateral consequences for people convicted of sexual offenses. Also true. It then manipulated how that was presented. Is it presented as a summary of scientific evidence, or what if it comes as an anecdote from a what I was hoping to be coded as a trustworthy criminal justice practitioner. And I always said I was going to try to avoid swearing here, but the title of that paper is "Nobody Gives a Shit," because there is no effect there. I mean, the vignettes are kind of weak. They're not of strong treatment, but none of those manipulations change support for the policy. So we have, this was not terribly surprising for us, but it is disappointing. So some of my follow-up research is looking specifically at, well, first, I have one paper under review that looks at why is this happening? Why don't people want to change their opinion on this? So that's something, kind of for a different conversation here. But I mean, for me, I would hope that a compelling argument for this is that, sex offender residence restrictions were designed as one of those policies, as kind of under that moral panic, regarding, sex offenders, that it's an attempt to do something about the risk of recidivism. And I would hope that appeals to, like, look, if you really do want to prevent these offenses from occurring, there are certain things that can be done, just not this. If residence restrictions produce collateral consequences, like more, housing instability, and that leads to enhanced recidivism, I would hope that, appealing to that argument, would begin to change minds when it came to, well, I do want to support, effective policies. So what are the things that are available out there? But I mean, so far, just what my research, what others' research have seen, is that it's very difficult to make appeals to reason when the formation of those opinions itself are not based on reason. So that's probably super pessimistic. Beth,
I'll be a little bit more positive, I guess, in some ways. I mean, I don't know how you change public opinion, and kudos to Jason for continuing this work, because I do think it is so important. But what I will kind of speak to is just there has been some shifts, I think, in legislation. We do have a tier system of sex offenses now, is because it's too costly, right? We can't keep people on parole forever. We have some states, they're on parole forever, they're on electronic monitoring, they're going back to prison. We see a large group of our population in prison are people who are probation or parole violators, right? People who violated their supervision. And so that's just become, like, we're not putting new people in prison as much, but we got this kind of revolving door. And so I see states are thinking about this in new ways, simply because it's too expensive. So I think that's one way, is that we are kind of, I always try to push back against this one size fit all policies, which we've had. So we've seen that just a ton. So I would like to continue that. If we're going to have residency restrictions, let's make sure to keep them to the smaller percent who actually do offend against smaller children. One call I'd like to have for people who are listening to this podcast who are our practitioners is that one thing I see is there's a number of people in the community doing phenomenal work on housing for people with felony offenses. Awesome work. But most of the people do not provide housing for people with a sex offense. And so I would like to encourage some of these, service providers, or maybe those funders, to, again, understand that not all sex offenses are the same. Not all people have the same risk of reoffense. And there's a lot of ways to look at risks now. I think there's a lot of ways to screen people, but to, try to better our policy in that area, because I think even the people who understand that this group has less risk aren't using those tools and have blanket policies. No people with sex offenses in the drug court, no people with sex offenses in diversion, no people with sex offenses in this housing. So again, I think as people who are out here working in the field and practitioners, we need to be like, is this the best policy? Most of these people are going to come home to our communities. And so it's really important to, kind of think about where they're going to go. Otherwise, they're going to live under the overpass, and people don't like that either. So that would be my thought.
Yeah, it's In a former life, I worked at the Massachusetts Treatment Center, and the men that were civilly committed that were released, we were lucky at that time to develop a connection, or somebody in the facility made a connection with a particular shelter in Boston. And I won't say the name just in case, but a shelter that was willing to receive the recently released civilly committed men. And not only did they have, I believe that they had small apartments, if memory serves right, in the facility. And there was a lot of support. There was a lot of supervision too, but there was a lot of support. And to my knowledge, there weren't any problems there. And the men really liked that particular environment. Some of my coworkers went to that facility in order to check it out, and they came back. They were really flabbergasted with the amount of support and positivity that was present there. I will add a little bit about this idea of the policies. I had a master's student that is now at East Tennessee with Jill Stinson, who studied for her master's these policies that are out there for managing people that come out of prison. And she exposed some to just it was a control. I can't remember at this point. The other one received a presentation on factors that help with desistance, and based on some of the work like Daniel Harris in Australia, although that's based in Massachusetts, and then presented a case and said, okay, in order to help this person not recidivate, what would you choose? And I don't remember all of the findings. I'm supposed to be reviewing that thesis for submission. But one of the really interesting things was that those who identify themselves as politically conservative really liked the desistance stuff. With housing, joining the military, getting married, joining a church. And I thought that, there might be a way to convince people. We think of I think of liberals as kind of like being more accepting, although with sex offenders, that's not necessarily the case. But there could be something there to providing for information for individuals that may be consistent with their own values, maybe to their own surprise.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some research out there that suggests that, particularly among those who identify as conservative Americans, like redemption stories, redemption arcs, that is a very classic kind of heartstring to pull, and people pull for that. It's really encouraging to hear that even for the stigmatized group, that is potentially a place where kind of relevant appeals to reason, can be made. It's I viewed part of the challenge there as, one of those kind of pervasive myths that's out there is that people with sex offense convictions, that there's something qualitatively different about them, that there's something irredeemable, about them, that this goes all the way up to, while we were reviewing research, we found evidence in Supreme Court proceedings that justices on the bench, believe that. So, I'm encouraged to hear about that, potential line of research there.
Yeah, but I do think that there's a challenge between individual redemption stories, and everybody loves one of those. I mean, I do too. But I do think that what we need is changes in this macro policy. And so when you say like, oh, do you want to see people desist, go to church, be a family person? Great. There's a lot of support for that. Who doesn't support that? But the reasons that this group is so stigmatized, and Jason talked about like this moral panic, is because of these blanket policies that are pretty severe. And what comes with them is not only legal restrictions, but also financial requirements. And I think that's also something that we don't talk about enough, is that everybody under supervision has to pay a lot of money, but then this group has to pay even more. So I think, and there hasn't been any movement other than the tiering system to kind of repeal some of these things. So I think there's support in small ways, but you know, it's kind of politically difficult to say that we should change these. And so I just see this with corrections in general. Everybody wants to add a thing, add another thing, add another thing, but it's repealing that becomes so difficult. So now I'm the pessimist.
We all get a turn.
Yeah. Yeah. And with politicians, it's very common that one kind of like emotional story leads them to work and change the law, because it was so touching to hear that person, and it's hard when we hear instances of somebody being assaulted. It certainly carries a very, very strong emotional response, and it's very difficult to divorce that from the bigger picture. It's always a challenge. Part of I'm clinically trained, so my idea is for in the treatment for the men to be able to lead a good life. I'm a big proponent of the good lives model, so that they can reintegrate into the community, have less stress as possible, and lead a good, comfortable life, and knowing that is going to decrease the criminogenic needs. I remember at the treatment center reading assessments and reading the histories of these men. And it's like, yeah, I mean, of course they did something that landed them in prison, given the stories that they had. But again, those are kind of like the extreme examples of this in this phenomena.
I think tying housing instability into the good lives model, as you note here, just like with the example you raised about the kind of housing opportunities in the city, where there are arrangements that are made, between correctional departments and certain housing entities in order to provide a stable environment, for individuals after they're released. And you could just hear, as you were describing in the testimonials of those who participated in there, how central having that sort of environment can be to implementing, a good lives model based rehabilitation strategy. So I just want to make sure we made that connection there.
That's a great point.
Yeah. And really for all of us, I mean, part of my other hat is looking at positive psychology, and, happiness and living the good life is based on relationships. And for that, we need a place to live, and we need a stable network. So, let me just check here. Any ending thoughts? We have quickly gotten to our time. Any parting wisdom? Something that you would like to see?
What do you think?
Sure. I mean, I think I'll just reiterate, and Jason can talk about the findings again, if that would be helpful. But I do think that, housing policy is a real key right now for every American, right? So I just heard on the radio that it's for the first time more affordable to rent than buy a house, and I think of any group that I can think of, people with a sex offense, this becomes, buying a house and having a stable home is like this pathway to the American dream and all of those things, right? I think that this has been cut off more than any other group is people with a sex offense. And so again, I would just encourage people to understand that sex offense residency restrictions being and residency restrictions, the scope of what a sex offense means is very broad. Another thing is it varies a lot by the state as well. And one thing I'm digging into more deeply recently is there's pretty substantial racial and ethnic disparities there, just like we see in other studies of other incarcerated populations, but we haven't talked about it as much with people with a sex offense. And so again, we have a large part of our society shut off from this opportunity that we know is so key to desistance. And so, I think we need to talk about anyone with a felony conviction when we talk about housing policy. And I just think this should be on the top of our mind as we do research and policy going forward with this group. But I'll leave it to Jason for the final word.
Yeah, I'll just say that as pessimistic as I may sound at some points, describing some aspects of my agenda, I mean, there is a clear case, in the research out there that housing is crucial, to reentry, and that there are examples of effective programs out there, like some of the programs that Grant Dewey has been connected to in Minnesota, offering kind of wraparound treatment services at housing, a lot like what you described, Alejandro, in Massachusetts, that these are effective, in terms of reducing recidivism. So we know that these things can work. It seems like part of the gap is connecting that to individuals convicted of sexual offenses. So, I can't think of any better place to start than with case planning, once an individual is getting ready to return to the community. And, from a practical standpoint, not just thinking about that initial housing placement, whether that first place is going into sex offense treatment, like as it was for so many of the individuals in our sample, going to a halfway house or a residential motel or something like that, but having a backup plan, understanding what the contingencies will be once that opportunity is no longer available, can kind of hopefully get in the way of this potential spiral of housing instability that we found is associated with increased odds of recidivism. So, if anybody is looking for that evidence that, well, if the housing situation breaks down and they start moving, quite frequently, what's the risk? You can look at our study. There is a risk, particularly for individuals convicted of sexual offenses. So try to step in before that becomes a problem. In terms of the specifics, I wish I had more to offer there, but I think that's the best way I can put a cap on it.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and for your wisdom. This has been a very interesting conversation on a very interesting topic that particularly clinicians may not be thinking about, as we tend to focus more on the individual. But I would like to thank you very much for participating.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to visit atsa.com for more information and more resources.